When the supercar market of the 1980s belonged to Ferrari, Lamborghini, and Porsche, very few people expected that Germany would produce a project created not by a major manufacturer, but by the owner of a company specializing in convertible roofs. And yet that is exactly how the 1983 Kodiak F1 was born, a car meant to combine German solidity, Italian sensuality, and the brutal force of an American V8 in one extraordinarily ambitious machine. Even its appearance made a huge impression. A low, wide body, pop-up headlights, a mid-mounted engine, and upward-opening doors that immediately brought the Mercedes-Benz C111 to mind. This was not a kit car, and it was not some garage fantasy with no substance behind it. It was a very serious supercar project, developed with the help of early CAD systems, a tubular space frame, a composite body, and a specification that, at least on paper, promised performance worthy of the era's top players. The Kodiak F1 was meant to be Germany's answer to the exotic cars of Italy, and at the same time, the fulfillment of Mladen Mitrović's personal dream. In the end, however, it remained one of the most fascinating what-if stories of the 1980s, a car almost forgotten, yet still capable of firing the imagination of any fan of classic supercars. The project was led by Mladen Mitrović, a Serbian-born entrepreneur working in West Germany, and the owner of Speed and Sport, a company specializing in convertible tops and interior equipment. In everyday business, the company dealt with very practical products, but Mitrović wanted to do something much bigger, to build his own supercar. According to accounts from the period, he had long been sketching his own vision of the ideal car, inspired both by Italian exotics and by German engineering. He was helped by project tools that were very advanced for the time, including computer-assisted frame calculations and cooperation with technical institutions. Some sources mention the University of Munich. Others refer to engineering circles in Stuttgart, involved in analyzing the frame's rigidity and load capacity. But all of them agree on one thing. The Kodiak was not designed by guesswork. It was developed with real technical care. The car made its public debut at the Frankfurt EII in 1983, at first practically without a recognizable brand identity, yet it immediately attracted a great deal of attention. In a world dominated by famous established manufacturers, a completely new and extremely aggressive-looking player had suddenly appeared, promising top-level performance, style, and engineering. Stylistically, the Kodiak F1 was very much a child of its time, but it never felt like a copy of anything. Yes, many commentators pointed to similarities with the Mercedes C111, some Porsche prototypes, and even the BMW M1, but Mitrović clearly tried to give the car its own identity. Its silhouette was extremely low and wide, with heavily flared arches, a short nose, a sharply cut cabin, and a massive rear section emphasizing the central position of the engine. The car measured around 4,340 millimeters in length, 1,980 millimeters in width, and 1,120 millimeters in height, which gave it truly supercar-like proportions. Weight distribution was quoted at approximately 56 to 44%, depending on the specification of the prototype. To that you could add the characteristic upward-opening doors, pop-up headlights, and taillights that some sources link stylistically to the Porsche 944. The overall effect looked remarkably mature for a machine developed outside a major factory. It was not some random design exercise, but a car created by someone who clearly understood what a buyer wanted if he was dreaming of something more dramatic than a Corvette and more exotic than a 911. Beneath the striking bodywork was a tubular space frame, which Mitrović treated as the foundation of the entire project. Some sources describe it as an aluminum or steel lattice integrated with structural protection elements, while others simply refer to it as a highly developed framework of square-section tubing with an integrated rollover structure. Whatever the details, all the materials agree that it offered high rigidity and very strong calculated structural resistance. The body itself was made from composite materials, Kevlar, carbon fiber, epoxy resins, and reinforced plastics all appear in the descriptions, and the overall construction method was often compared with aviation practice. This allowed the car to combine low weight with high strength. Depending on the version and the source, curb weight was quoted at roughly 100 kilograms, which, with planned power outputs ranging from 300 to as much as 550 horsepower, promised very serious performance. The drag coefficient was listed as CD 0.38, and Mitrovic even employed a full underbody covering and carefully managed airflow through the engine bay, showing that this was being conceived as a true supercar, not just a conventional sports coupe. In its best-known and most basic configuration, the powertrain relied on an American Corvette V8. Most often, the engine is described as either a 5.4-liter or 5.7-liter Chevrolet small block, depending on the source and the specific prototype being discussed. Output was estimated at anywhere from 320 to 348 horsepower, although promotional and press material also mentioned 340 horsepower, and even 350 horsepower in the earliest projections. This was not an exotic, complex engine, but a classic pushrod V8 with a cast-iron block, and it offered one huge advantage: plenty of power, easy servicing, and relatively reasonable cost. Some descriptions mention Brodix heads, Bosch fuel injection, or a 4-Weber carburetor setup, which suggests that the engine program remained quite flexible during development. The engine was mounted ahead of the rear axle in a mid-rear configuration, and power was transmitted through a 5-speed ZF manual gearbox with a limited slip differential. It was a very sensible combination: American torque, German transmission, lightweight construction, and bodywork, with an unmistakably supercar character. On paper, it sounded like the recipe for a car that would be fast, brutal, and at the same time more practical than many of its Italian rivals. Mitrovic did not, however, want to limit the car to just one powertrain option. At the same time, he considered Mercedes-Benz VB8 engines, including 5-liter and 5.6-liter units, both in standard form and in versions prepared by the then-independent AMG. Period reports regularly mention around 380 horsepower for the AMG version, as well as an even more extreme concept involving a 6-liter Mercedes V8 with as much as 550 horsepower. Combined with a weight of only about 1 metric ton, that would have produced performance that was almost absurd for the mid-1980s. Some sources even mention the possibility of exceeding 200 kilometers per hour in under 10 seconds in the most powerful version. Ironically, it may have been exactly these shifts in concept that helped damage the project. A car that had initially seemed relatively simple and attainable, thanks to the American V8, gradually drifted toward becoming a more and more ambitious, more and more expensive product. Instead of putting the basic version into limited production quickly, Mitrovic appears to have tried to refine and elevate the project so much that the market moved on without him, and by the middle of the decade, monsters like the Porsche 959 and Ferrari F40 had arrived and instantly changed the definition of a supercar. The suspension and braking systems also revealed a very serious engineering attitude. Several sources described double wishbones at both the front and the rear, with coil springs, anti-roll bars, and Koni dampers, while other materials mention adjustable threaded suspension using Eibach components. That does not necessarily mean a contradiction. More likely, it shows that the prototypes differed from one another, or that the project evolved over time. The steering was described as a rack and pinion system, with some mention of power assistance from a BMW 7 Series or components sourced from the BMW M1. The brakes were ventilated discs using Brembo hardware, or, according to some period reports, racing-type calipers in a Porsche-like specification. The car rode on Pirelli P7 tires. All of this shows how strongly the car was oriented toward traction and the image of a true big boy from the supercar world. With such tires, light construction, and a powerful V8, The Kodiak F1 genuinely had the potential not just to look menacing, but to move in a way that fully justified its predatory name. The performance figures quoted for the Kodiak F1 were impressive already in 1983, and they still command respect today. Depending on the exact version and stage of the project, the figures mentioned included 5.2 seconds from 0 to 100 kilometers per hour, 22 seconds from 0 to 200, and a top speed ranging from 230 kilometers per hour for a more conservatively tuned test car, all the way to 315 kilometers per hour in the most ambitious projections. These variations come from the fact that the prototype tested by the press was not always identical to the show car or the planned production version. But one thing is clear. The car was fast. It also had a large fuel tank, described in some sources as 140 liters, and in others as even 160 liters in two centrally mounted tanks. That suggests the car was intended for long-distance high-speed travel, not just short sprints away from traffic lights. Fuel consumption was estimated at roughly 17 liters per 100 kilometers on average, which, given the performance and the era, hardly sounds shocking. The Kodiak was never meant to be economical. It was intended to be a fast, spectacular, luxurious projectile that could terrify even Countach and Testarossa drivers on the Autobahn. The F1's cabin was just as distinctive as its bodywork. This was a two-seater, but not an austere one. On the contrary, Mitrović wanted his car to offer luxury and equipment comparable to expensive GT cars. Inside, there were leather seats, a Momo steering wheel, an elaborate dashboard with a full set of analog instruments, and an audio system that became almost legendary. Sources consistently mention a sound system with 22 speakers, which sounded almost absurd in the mid-1980s, but also perfectly reflected the spirit of the time. There was also air conditioning, electric equipment, and in general a very rich standard specification. Promotional materials stressed that the F1 was not a stripped-out competition machine, but a full-blooded road-going supercar. On one hand, it was supposed to accelerate like a true exotic. On the other, it was meant to offer the comfort and equipment expected by customers accustomed to luxury. That contrast is especially interesting. From the outside, the car looked like an aggressive beast, but inside it was an attempt to combine prestige, hi-fi, comfort, and the complete supercar experience. These details show that Mitrović did not want to build just a German rocket. He wanted to create a German alternative to the Italian way of life behind the wheel. Unfortunately, as so often happens with small manufacturers, the most impressive thing turned out to be not the list of strengths, but the list of problems. The project dragged on. The car evolved, costs rose, and the projected price stopped being attractive. At first, people talked about $48,000, later around $117,000, and German press materials regularly mentioned 190,000 Deutsche Marks. That meant the Kodiak F1 had entered the territory of the most dangerous rivals. In 1983, it might still have tempted buyers with freshness and a strong performance-to-price image, but a few years later, anyone with that kind of budget could already be looking at a Porsche 959, a Ferrari F40, or other serious machines with established reputations. On top of that, there are repeated reports of a fire at a supplier or coach builder that supposedly destroyed the negative body molds, effectively killing the dream of limited series production. Other sources speak more generally of stagnation, lack of money, and the fact that Mitrović simply no longer had the strength or capital to continue. Whatever the exact version, the ending was the same. By around 1988, the project was dead, and speed and sport returned to its core business. The question of how many cars were actually built remains unclear to this day, which only adds to the Kodiak's legend. Some sources speak of one example, some say 1 or 2 prototypes, and others even mention 6 cars, of which 2 supposedly survived. The most credible conclusion seems to be the cautious one. The car shown in Frankfurt in 1983 definitely existed, and it is very likely that a second prototype was also built, probably with Mercedes power or intended for the American market. In 2009, the Corvette-engined prototype appeared on eBay and was offered for around $50,000, which sounds almost unbelievable from today's perspective. The present-day value of the Kodiak F1 is therefore more an estimate than a hard market fact, taking into account its uniqueness, design, era, engineering, and the growing interest in niche 1980s supercars. Such a car could realistically be worth at least several $100,000 today, and perhaps even more in the right collector environment. On the other hand, the lack of a real brand, its limited recognition, and its murky history may all cap the price. That is exactly what makes the Kodiak so fascinating. It is at the same time a potential treasure and a major unknown. Today, the Kodiak F1 remains one of the most intriguing forgotten supercars in Europe. It never won a major race, never entered production, and never built a legend on the scale of Ferrari or Lamborghini. And yet it has something that cannot be faked, the authenticity of a dream. This was a car created by a man who genuinely wanted to build his own supercar and had the courage to push that vision all the way to the stage of a functioning prototype. It had striking looks, very modern construction, intelligently chosen components, and performance that was not merely an empty promise. It failed not because it was ridiculous or poorly conceived, but because the supercar world is brutal, expensive, and merciless toward small players. In that sense, the Kodiak F1 perfectly symbolizes the 1980s, an era of excess, courage, wedge-shaped silhouettes, and people who believed they could climb from the garage straight into the pantheon of automotive gods. Not everyone succeeded, but some at least managed to create something that is still worth talking about. The Kodiak F1 absolutely belongs in that group.